August 17, 1944. A dusty road cuts through the rolling fields of Iowa. The summer air is heavy with the smell of corn and diesel fuel. On the horizon, a U.S. Army truck rattles toward a sprawling farmstead, sunlight glinting off its olive-drab hood. Inside the back, 20 German prisoners of war, young men in faded field grey, sit shoulder to shoulder, their faces blank with fatigue and uncertainty. They had been captured in Normandy, shipped across the Atlantic under tight guard, and processed through Camp Algona, one of dozens of POW camps scattered across the American Midwest. For many of them, this, America, was a myth. They had been told of a land of chaos, racial strife, and decadence. What they saw instead were endless fields of wheat, grain silos gleaming like cathedrals, and farmhouses bigger than the officers' quarters they had left behind in Europe. Private Eric Bauer, 21, stared out through the slats in the truck bed. "Is this all one farm?" he muttered, his voice low and uncertain. Beside him, Sergeant Carl Meyer squinted into the distance. "No," he said softly. "This must be a village." The truck braked sharply, kicking up dust. The driver, a young American in a sweat-stained undershirt, called out, "All right, boys." End of the line, the prisoners climbed down under the watchful eyes of two guards armed with Garand rifles. The farmer who greeted them was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, his hands rough but his smile disarmingly kind. "Name's Henry Thompson," he said, tipping his hat. "You work hard, you eat well. Fair deal?" None of the Germans replied. They only nodded, unsure if they were allowed to speak freely. That afternoon, they were put to work harvesting corn. The Americans gave them gloves, hats, and cold water from a metal jug that sweated in the heat. As they worked, Eric watched the machines, massive John Deere tractors and mechanical reapers, rumble across the fields. The sound was deafening, the efficiency staggering. Back home, his father had plowed with a single horse and a wooden plow. Here, one machine did the work of 50 men. By evening, the prisoners were led to a makeshift mess area beside the barn. Metal trays were set out, filled with roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, buttered corn, and thick slices of bread. There was milk, cold, fresh, and unlimited. Eric stared at his tray. "They eat like this every day," he whispered. Sergeant Meyer gave a short laugh that wasn't really a laugh. "Our officers in France never ate this well," he said. Around them, the Americans joked, chewed, and passed second helpings without a thought. One of the guards offered the prisoners coffee, real coffee, not the barley substitute they had grown used to. The rich, bitter aroma filled the barn. It was then that realization began to set in, not spoken aloud, but shared silently among the captured men. If the farmers of America lived like this, if even the smallest towns were filled with this abundance, what chance did Germany truly have? Night fell over the Iowa plains. The prisoners lay in bunks inside a converted barn, the smell of hay mixing with the lingering scent of dinner. Outside, the hum of distant machinery continued late into the night. Eric couldn't sleep. He stared at the rafters above him, listening to the soft breathing of the men around him. The thought wouldn't leave his mind. If this is how they live in peace, how much more can they make for war? He didn't say it aloud, but others were thinking it too. Across that dimly lit barn, several pairs of eyes were open in the dark, watching, listening, and realizing for the first time that the Reich's promised victory had been built on a lie. The next morning, as dawn broke over the golden fields, the guards arrived with breakfast. Pancakes, bacon, syrup. The sweet smell filled the air, and one of the Germans shook his head slowly, smiling despite himself. "We are prisoners," he said softly, "but we eat like kings." They all laughed quietly then, not with joy, but with disbelief. By late September 1944, the POWs had settled into a rhythm of work that felt strangely peaceful. Every morning they rose before sunrise, loaded onto trucks, and fanned out across the patchwork farmland of northern Iowa. The war in Europe still raged. Berlin filled the airwaves back home with talk of sacrifice and ultimate victory. But here, the land itself seemed to deny it. Eric Bauer often found himself working alongside local farmhands, boys barely older than him, and even a few girls who drove tractors with easy skill. The Americans laughed freely, called each other by first name, and treated the Germans not as enemies, but as extra hands helping bring in the harvest. The first time Eric was asked to ride the combine harvester, he hesitated. The machine looked like something out of a science fiction magazine. Blades spinning, belts whirring, gears humming. The farmer, Mr. Thompson, grinned and said, "Don't worry, kid. Just keep her steady." The engine roared to life, drowning out thought. As the machine devoured rows of corn, Eric's jaw slackened in awe. In Germany, their tractors had been requisitioned by the Wehrmacht. Entire villages ploughed fields by hand, their labourers half-starved, their horses gone to the front. But here, one man and one machine could feed hundreds. At lunch, they sat beneath a tree while Mrs. Thompson brought out sandwiches stacked with ham and cheese, jars of pickles, and apple pie still warm from the oven. The smell alone was enough to stop conversation. Karl Meyer chewed slowly, staring at his plate. "Back home," he said finally, "we were told the Americans were soft, that they would collapse under rationing, that they had no discipline." Eric looked around the farmyard, the tractors, the barns, the fields stretching past the horizon. "If this is weakness," he said quietly, "then God help the strong." The guards, hearing the laughter that followed, didn't intervene. They were used to it now, the Germans' incredulity, their quiet amazement. In truth, many of the Americans enjoyed showing off what they called the good life. To them, it was proof of what they fought for. To the prisoners, it was something else entirely. Evidence that the enemy's power came not from cruelty or conquest, but from capacity, machines, food, and a system that actually worked. As weeks turned into months, the contrast gnawed at them. Letters from home when they came spoke of hunger and cold, of bombed cities and endless shortages. Some prisoners, ashamed, stopped reading them altogether. They couldn't bear to reconcile what they saw every day, the abundance of an American farm, with the misery their families faced under Hitler's war. At night, after work, they sat in the barracks, listening to the hum of distant tractors. They talked about what they had seen: warehouses full of canned food, trains stacked with grain, trucks loaded with machines. "This is only one state," Meyer said one evening. "Imagine all of them together. How can we win?" No one answered. That winter, the farmers brought them wool coats and thicker blankets. The POWs helped fix fences, mend roofs, even repair machinery. They were still prisoners, still watched by armed guards, but some began to feel a strange affection for the people around them. One December morning, snow covered the fields like a clean sheet. Eric stepped outside the barracks, breath steaming in the cold, and heard the faint crackle of a radio from the farmhouse window. Bing Crosby's voice drifted through the air. "I'll be home for Christmas." He smiled despite himself. For the first time in years, The sound of an enemy's song made him feel human. As the war dragged on, many of the Germans would later say that those Iowa fields changed them more than any battle. They had seen what freedom and prosperity looked like, and how different it was from the promises of the Reich. It wasn't the bombs or bullets that broke their faith. It was the breakfast table. Spring of 1945 brought mud, thaw, and a shift in the air. The war in Europe was ending. The guards no longer spoke with the tense stiffness of before. Their radios carried talk of Allied armies closing in on Berlin. Even the prisoners, who once avoided conversation about the front, listened in silence when the names of shattered German cities were mentioned. For Erich Bauer, each day now felt like a strange dream, half relief, half guilt. The farm around him thrived. The Thompsons were planting new corn, the machinery cleaned and shining under the April sun. The smell of turned soil filled the air, and on the long walks back from the fields, Eric would stare at the distant town, its tidy homes with electric lights, its shops filled with food and cloth. He couldn't stop thinking of home, his mother in Saxony, queuing for bread, wondering if her son was still alive. One afternoon, he found himself in the barn, helping Henry Thompson repair a broken axle. The older man worked silently, his face streaked with sweat and oil. After a while, Henry said, "When I was your age, boy, I was out here too. My pa ran this farm through the Depression. Hard times, but we always had something to eat." Eric hesitated, unsure if he should respond. Then he said quietly, "In Germany, even officers cannot always eat meat. My mother writes that she cannot find butter." Henry paused, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's a damn shame," he said. "When this war's over, you tell her the world's got enough food for everyone. Just needs fewer men trying to take it all." He smiled and went back to work. The sentence stuck with Eric for the rest of the day. That evening, Mrs. Thompson brought dinner to the long table in the barn. Beef stew, bread and coffee. The POWs ate slowly, savoring every bite. Around them, the guards chatted about baseball scores and ration coupons. It wasn't luxury, but it was normalcy, and that normalcy felt almost sacred. Sergeant Meyer looked up from his tray. "When I get home," he said, "I will tell them about this. They won't believe me. They think Americans live like kings while we starve." "They have no idea across from him," another prisoner laughed bitterly. "And if they do believe you, they'll call you a traitor." Meyer nodded. "Perhaps. But the truth is, the truth outside." The sun dipped low, turning the horizon to fire. The silhouette of a windmill turned slowly against the orange sky. Eric thought of how strange it was that a farm, so far from the front lines, could destroy an idea more completely than 1,000 bombs. When news of Germany's surrender came in May, the reaction at the camp was muted. There was no cheering, no mourning, only silence. Some men hung their heads, others stared into space. For many, the war had ended months earlier, in their minds, the day they first realized the truth about the country they'd fought for. Over the next weeks, some POWs were sent home. Others stayed to finish the harvest, their work too valuable to interrupt. Henry Thompson shook hands with each of them when they left. When it came time for Eric to go, Henry pressed a small package into his hands, a tin of coffee and a photograph of the farm, the family smiling in front of their red barn. "For your mother," he said simply. Eric swallowed hard and nodded. "Danke." He didn't know if he would ever see them again, but he knew he would never forget them. Years later, when he told his children about the war, he didn't talk about the battles, or the defeat, or the prison camps. He told them about Iowa, about the cornfields, the tractors, and the family who showed him that the strength of America wasn't in its weapons, but in its abundance and its decency. And somewhere deep down, he always remembered that first day in the barn, the smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread, and the laughter that filled the air as he realized that everything he'd been taught about the enemy was wrong. In the end, it wasn't the war that changed him. It was the harvest,